Welcome to Nicola Caccavella's Milestone 4 final thesis defense entitled Architecting In-Between-ness, Human-Centered Design for Toronto's Arrival Cities. Will Galloway is Nicola's supervisor. Noheir Elgendy is the second reader, and we have Marco Polo as the associate chair of the graduate program joining us. I'm Carlo Parente, and I'm acting as the program representative. We also have joining us today 3 external reviewers. We have Roberto Damiani, a designer, curator, and scholar who's currently an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and the interim coordinator of the post-professional program. We also have Rocco Maragna, an architect and urban designer and principal of his own practice, Maragna Architect Inc. And we have Sasha Radulovic, who's a Bosnian Canadian architect and co-founder and partner of the Winnipeg-based firm 5468796 Architecture. Nicola, as your previous milestone presentations, you'll have approximately 20 minutes to present. Then we'll have approximately 30+ minutes for clarifications, questions, and comments from the committee. If you're ready, Nicola, please start.
Thank you. All right, as mentioned, the thesis title is Architecting In-Between-ness, Human-Centered Design for Toronto's Arrival Cities, and it seeks to address some of the issues that certain vulnerable communities, namely low-income immigrant groups living in Toronto, face. These tensions often revolve around a sense of belonging, socioeconomic integration, and community life, or lack thereof. And the first acknowledgement is that architecture and planning alone can't solve all of these problems, but what it can do is help alleviate some of the obstacles that are currently in place. The research and design project takes place in Toronto's arrival cities, a term used to describe not the metropolis itself, but rather the densely packed landing pad neighborhoods that are composed of mostly low-income immigrants within it. While Toronto immigration was originally concentrated in the inner city, the early 1990s marked a shift to new reception centers in the suburbs, both within Toronto and the GTA. Priced out of the ethnic enclaves of the past, many of today's less prosperous newcomers instead find themselves in Toronto's apartment tower blocks derived from post-war modernism. 2 converging trends contribute to several problematic outcomes for today's residents, this being the city's planning policies of the time, which stipulated strict residential zoning and minimum density requirements for outward growth that primarily targeted middle-income car-owning couples and families, along with the popularity of North American modernist planning that centered around inflexible monofunctional programming and massive neighborhood-scaled developments. From an architectural theory perspective, seeing like a state and a city is not a tree are used to help support this argument. The premise of their work being that the modernist desire to make society so-called legible simply meant formalizing all of the informal processes that contribute to a thriving neighborhood. The residents in these neighborhoods are finding ways to manipulate the system by introducing makeshift solutions to better identify with their living environments, but change will always be marginal given the current context. And so the goal becomes not trying to create a new typology that exists separate of this reality, but rather one that supports this informal nature and community-oriented lifestyle. While the question I'm trying to answer is how to make these places more livable, the work is ultimately addressing how we can design for all people. For the purpose of this project, arrival cities will be looked at through the specific context of Thorncliffe Park, an apartment tower neighborhood in Toronto's inner suburbs distinguished by its dense and multicultural population. The site maintains all of the qualities of today's arrival cities. While originally intended for the middle class, it's been home to a primarily low-income immigrant population and Canada's largest Islamic community for over 70 years. Today, it's one of the city's most prominent immigrant reception centers with a newcomer population of 64%. The neighborhood's domestic makeup also has an unproportionately high percentage of children under the age of 14 and families of 5 or more, characteristic of many immigrant households. While Thorncliffe was master planned to comfortably accommodate 12,500 residents, it houses approximately 30,000 who are dispersed across 39 buildings with no new housing developed since the 1970s. Toronto's rising housing unaffordability compels many low-income tenants to remain in these overcrowded conditions. Additionally, several community spaces will be lost following the approval of a Metrolinx train yard. These include family-owned restaurants, South Asian and Middle Eastern grocery stores, the Sunni Mosque, and more. Between its population of 30,000, there will only remain 14 community spaces. The The neighborhood is presented with several physical barriers limiting walkability and spatially isolating Thorncliffe from the rest of Toronto, a condition worsened by the lower than average car ownership per capita. With over 50% of the lot usage designated to residential, there are limited places for any remaining activities, but the few that do exist are compartmentalized and dispersed, resulting in a separation of residents and an inactive streetscape. Despite Thorncliffe's problems, the community remains resilient. While a majority of the neighborhood's built form is overly determined and regimented, life still happens in between. Open green spaces have been transformed into community gardens. Underutilized built spaces have become places for overlapping social and economic spheres by hosting community markets and local cafes. And the indeterminacy of apartment balconies allows for a wide array of uses that exemplifies how residents might manipulate a space when they're able to. The theme of in-betweenness is one which appears throughout this thesis. It's used to outline not only the types of architectural processes that can be employed to facilitate user personalization, but also to describe the aforementioned spaces that are important to those who live in arrival cities today, with the argument that both of these, the architectural space and the architectural process, aid in capturing some of the informality brought about by diverse users. Organizationally, this research is broken down into two parts, in-between agency and in-between form. The idea behind the former is that to accommodate user personalization, architecture can look toward a process that invites shared agency between the architect and the users. The case studies examined in this section demonstrate the various ways this has been achieved, whether that was accomplished through the craftsmanship of the immigrant residents themselves, an extensive collaborative design process, or by means of the architectural form itself. A major takeaway was that these adaptations were not solely a matter of aesthetics or function, but also about participating in community identity and creating a place in which they felt they belong. Certain precedents were looked at for their ability to accommodate diverse usage through taking on a multiplicity of forms. The themes of polyvalence and open-endedness were looked at as a way to achieve this shared agency and a way for architecture to adjust the user's desire for privacy and interiority. In-between form describes the intermediary places of Jan Gale that Jan Gale argues are an aspect of architecture that deserve more recognition. The potential of these places lies in their indeterminacy, especially when the primary spaces are overly determined and regimented. In Toronto's apartment tower neighborhoods, for example, this is where newcomers are able to personalize their surroundings, connect with neighbors, and contribute to the larger community. The case studies examined in this section demonstrate the importance of the street and shared spaces in the immigrant arrival cities, and how they can be used as a tool to connect people and program and strengthen community life. Past ethnic enclaves were examined for how they promote active streets by blending interior and exterior realms, incorporating third places, and maintaining human scale. Additionally, several social housing projects were studied as precedents for how they employed their in-between spaces to highlight places for social interaction and enable community to form naturally, and what architectural considerations achieved this. A conceptual framework guided by the aforementioned themes is created to serve as a foundation for a human-centered proto-design of a multi-use housing typology allocated to arrival cities. The following design project seeks to aid the local problems given the current context through local interventions that target integration by means of strengthening community life, embedding socioeconomic opportunities, and improving connectivity to and throughout the project. While it considers a certain demographic and geographic context, it is ultimately about how architecture can better respond to the diverse ways of living and being together. The framework is as follows: maintain human scale, incorporate third places, make the building an extension of its environment, blend interior and exterior, and include indeterminate space. To introduce the proto-design and how it diverges from other models, a comparative study looks at the differences between the typology in today's arrival cities, the contemporary model that is being implemented citywide, and which is sort of kind of generic, and the proto-design. Each were examined in regards to their density, circulation, and community space, followed by how they function at the neighborhood scale. For floor area, the proto-design provides the greatest density at 0.404 people per square meter, the most circulation at 19%, and the most community space at 9%. While there have been several high-density developments following the post-war typology, most have been accompanied by minimum comfortability standards, as see the image in the middle there. Additionally, there are typically no multifamily units included in both past and present models, and few three-bedroom units. While the studies were predominantly catered toward the building form, their effect at the neighborhood scale was examined as well. Clear similarities between past and present models are displayed in regards to how residents are forced to leave the respective complexes to be socially and economically connected. The proto-design aims to combat this with embedded resources and a multi-use typology that invites and attracts the users as opposed to sending them away. The building is informed by a human-focused approach that was conceived to restore the ideals of community, adaptability, and connectivity to the immigrant-dominated arrival city through considering in-between-ness. Design thinking was deployed to deliver an architecture that serves people's changing need through a polyvalent form that mediates the lines of overdetermined versus undetermined, and that will work in long-term and in various ways. Based on observations of human interaction, adaptation, and exploitation of their environment, architects have a compilation of data to provide a conceptual layer for housing rationale that serves especially useful when considering in-between-ness. These overlooked intermediary places offer areas of opportunity to implement this methodology in a bottom-up approach. While canvassing Thorncliffe Park, children can be witnessed playing on garage park roof, while others swing from a hand-tied seat in a tree, and on occasion, impromptu markets appear in public spaces selling various handmade wares and cultural cuisine. The concept of the building evolved out of a physical framework that would not only provide structural support, but also encourage users to utilize all parts of it as they were expected to. The people of Thorncliffe gain agency to adapt the frame as they see fit, whether that be a climbing wall, swing set, or a market shelter. And this sort of design thinking weaves its way into much of the design itself to facilitate the activities that are already happening. Moving on to the project, located in the heart of the neighborhood, RV Bruges Park, the first major design intervention is the introduction of several widened paths, streets, and the north-south extension of the park, which both heightens connectivity to and between the site surroundings, linking several of Thorncliffe's formal and informal landmarks, while also increasing park space. A central Woonerf is introduced to create safe and lively streets to accommodate access by several means of transportation. This is looked at as an extension of the public landscape, as there are no curbs or sidewalks, signaling that shared use is encouraged. Intentional zones for driving are painted in light gray and are accompanied by green bike paths alongside them. This visual change in landscaping helps to differentiate the main Woonerf from strictly non-vehicular paths, which are determined by blue tonal colors. Fixed planters and seating provide physical protection, prioritizing the people using this landscape. Like the building, the surrounding context follows a rhythmic language, but undulates to gently suggest directional movement and connect various programs throughout the site. These organic lines flow through and around the architecture, leading the eye toward shop fronts and community spaces. Based on observations noted about where people interact, pathways were laid out to converge and then expand at thresholds for meeting and gathering. In areas where lines contract and become narrower, it is assumed that they will serve primarily as circulation space. The introduction of a wide spectrum of seating arrangement, both fixed and unfixed, allow people flexibility in terms of where they sit and whom they sit with. A shared winter garden, sports court, step seating, and several pavilion-like multifunctional rooms are introduced as third places to anchor the community. These break the underlying grid, differentiating them from all other program. They're accessible by both the Woonerf and non-vehicular paths and are choreographed in a way that invites users to explore the public landscape, creating paths of desire. Where the building's physical framework meets the ground, it creates a semi-enclosed intermediary that is defined by these structural members. As mentioned previously, this space could serve as anything from a swing set structure to a market shelter, or simply as a space for circulation, as shown in this illustration. This condition creates an active urban edge. It both enables life to form naturally in a dialogue between adjacent built forms and conceptually opens up the building to the public sphere. Maintaining human scale, the proto-design is a 5-story mid-rise and able to maintain visual and conceptual connectivity to its surroundings while achieving adequate density. When a building is excessively tall, it becomes disconnected from the street and with that human perspective. In-between spaces become effective for interaction when visual connections can be made to the streetscape. The further they're located from the street, the more isolated they become. A considerable amount of the building's area is designated to the shared walkways found within the building's secondary skin. This atrium space is located in between private and public realms and connects people throughout the building. The aim is to create an overlapping intermediary that evokes an atmosphere of comfort and security and invites serendipitous encounters and informal gathering. This condition further reinforces a blending of interior and exterior realms. As Gail observes, These transitional zones between the dwelling and the street supports life between buildings. Sorry, one sec. Seating lines the walkway and spaces with the most potential for these experiences to occur. For example, near stairway entrances and in areas where the corridor expands. The variety of opportunities for trans activity to happen unfold along the intermediary. The combination of a double skin facade and setback upper floor corridors result in a creation of the stack effect. Warm air will rise throughout the space, providing a comfortable environment for residents to enjoy outside of their units. Along this intermediary are embedded multifunctional rooms to further promote communal gathering. These areas are highlighted as community anchors and are signified by a vibrant yellow structure, providing a lively backdrop for whatever activities may take place. They are distinguishable by the rotation to the public sphere, with unobstructed glazing to signal its accessibility as a semi-public area while interacting with the adjacent ground floor landscape. And if an event held in this space requires privacy, the use of an adjustable curtain can accommodate this. Openings proliferate throughout each level, providing a layer of transparency to observe those around or be observed by those below. The walls of these spaces are left blank to allow residents to personalize a portion of the building in the form of paintings and murals. The architectural language of the proto-design furthers the idea of a privacy gradient, as the rhythm of vertical slats expand and contract to offer more or less privacy in designated areas. The interior facade is lined with close-knit wooden slats, provoking a sense of warmth and movement along the shared corridor. The further one moves away from the units, the more open and transparent the building becomes as it reaches the edge of the public sphere. The secondary glass skin is lined with metal slats of the same dimension as those found throughout the building, but are spaced at a larger distance. The building's ground floor public space attracts interest by accommodating all three types of public activities Gale observed: the necessary, the optional, and the social. Hosting programs like a supermarket, social club, daycare, language and skills development, faith institutions, and other programs. Utility spaces are tucked away and accordion doors line adjacent facades, creating an adaptable open space that can be subdivided on later on as needed. These illustrations exemplify how this might look. To better understand Arrival City home life, studies were conducted on the ways in which residents of Thorncliffe made this neighborhood their home. An important aspect of immigrant daily life is the dedication to practice cultural traditions in their new dwelling. This is how an in-betweenness of identity is formed and brings about new cultural diversity to the host community. In some cases, this can be as simple as using the small indeterminate spaces of a home for culturally specific purposes that give significant value to the household. The kitchen can be regarded as the heart of the home, where people gather for food and company, and many cultures have not strayed from this way of being, and to some residents of Thorncliffe, the kitchen and the dining room are the most important part of their dwelling. To others, the living room is the most important space. While located within the private domain, they are among the most public spaces of the household, as they are typically the only place large enough to host gatherings or alter its functions. Each unit has been transformed to suit the needs of its diverse residents, and the traditional mode of using rooms based on their functional programming is disregarded, instead acting as what is needed at that point in time. One of the commonly noted examples of this is the enabling of informal economies, including cleaning services, catering, babysitting, tutoring, personal care services, leather repair, and tech repair. Using the 4x5 meter grid of the physical framework of various modules of sizes 4x5, 4x2, 2.5, 2.5 by 2.5 were found to be ideal in hosting a variety of ways in which residents were already using their apartments. Apart from the spaces with fixed uses, such as kitchens and washrooms, each room is interchangeable with one another and don't include defining characteristics which designate how they should be used. Based on the residents' manipulation of their current spaces in conjunction with the reinterpretation of what it means to be together, a number of unit variations were created to facilitate this through a polyvalent layout. There are 4 different unit sizes, all of them 2 stories, which range in comfortably housing 1 to 6 people. The largest unit is intended to host a multifamily household with the inclusion of a lower level room and full bath that are ideal for elderly residents hoping to avoid the daily use of stairs. Each upper level room includes doors to adjacent rooms. These can be left open or closed to alter the ways in which accommodate more or less, can be left open or closed to alter the space in ways which accommodate more or less people as required. This facilitates the common occurrence of separating children's rooms based on gender as needed. For example, if a family has more boys than girls and wants to place them in a larger area, such as 2 adjacent rooms with an open accordion door, they could do so. The lower level introduces 2 areas that have the potential to become one: a private family or gathering area, and an indeterminate space that can be defined by the residents. The stairs within each individual unit are placed adjacent to the shared walkway and are visible through moderately spaced wooden slats. As a result, both semi-private and semi-public circulation provide another layer of connectivity as the residents navigate them. A privacy gradient appears at different scales throughout the building. At the unit scale, the semi-private and indeterminate spaces blend the semi-public shared walkway into the dwelling. A second layer of accordion doors may add to the continuity of this space or close it off to allow more privacy. The upper level provides the highest degree of privacy as each room is enclosed and only accessible from the interior unit stairs. Conversely, the balcony acts as a semi-private space, but with heightened connectivity to the shared walkway below. The indeterminate space is made up of a series of 2.5 by 2.5 meter modules, each divided via adjustable accordion style doors that enables residents to alter the unit's privacy and interiority. Each opening is accompanied by an overhead curtain to adjust visibility, as the first layer of accordion doors contains large glass inserts. Different combinations may suggest different preferences. A closed door with an open curtain will provide partial interiority, while a closed door with a lower curtain indicates a higher degree of both privacy and interiority. This enables several possibilities for how this space interacts with others, able to open itself up to the adjacent shared corridor, becoming an extension of the semi-public intermediary, open itself up to the family space, increasing the size of the private program, close itself off from either of these spaces and act independently, or incorporate a variation of opening it up and itself up or closing itself off. If residents want to set up shop and potentially formalize a public informal economic endeavor, they could do so, as seen in this illustration. And conversely, they can make this endeavor private, visualized through this one. This decision is left for each household to decide. The unit's polyvalency stems from this condition, as well as the evolution of the optimal star model of spatial organization, which limits the amount of dead end or through passing space it has. This body of work argues for an architecture that focuses on a human-centered design as a means to promote resilient built forms that are capable of accommodating the uncertainty of new user groups and new modes of living. Regarding the number of immigrants living in Toronto's arrival cities, this architecture becomes even more pertinent to incorporate throughout the city. The proto-design seeks to help minimize the inherent obstacles that low-income immigrants already face. And guided by the framework, the architecture highlights the themes of shared agency and shared space. At different scales, from the neighborhood to the building to the unit, key elements are embedded and synthesized to create a collective identity of belonging, connectivity, and community building for its residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. So I think before we open things up to comments and questions, I'm going to ask if anyone has questions of clarification based on what Nicola presented. And maybe we'll start with Roberto.
Yes, thank you. It was a great presentation, Nicola. Thank you so much. Maybe first question is about density and how many units there are in your proposal.
Yeah, so the per floor, because they're 2-story units, per floor it accommodates about 123 people, which is a lot, mainly because of the multifamily units and there's kind of a variation, right?
Okay, thank you. In terms of feedback, we do another round, Carlo?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Rocco, do you have any questions of clarification?
Nicola, thank you for this presentation. My question at this point is, what is the ownership in your mind in other words, the building gets built, who owns it? And a parallel discussion, or at least a parallel question, is who owns all the other building? In other words, who is the ownership of that Thorncliffe Park, including the building?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues today is that a majority of these buildings are privately owned, and they're only up for rent. So the people that are living here who are kind of striving for home ownership, they're unable to do so. And they can't, like I mentioned, they don't really have the option to leave, especially with the rising housing unaffordability. So the idea, I think, would be that it's owned by the government, but I haven't addressed that too much. But privately owned, it seems to not be working, especially given the current context in Thorncliffe.
Okay. Thank
Sasha, any questions of clarification?
I do. Thanks, Nicola. This was some great thinking. I do have a question. How does this relate directly to your area of study? And what are your intentions? Is the intention to infill, or is the intention to replace, or what is the notion behind that?
Yeah, so it was kind of toward the end of my document, I talk about how this prototype can kind of be implemented in different cities. And with this project, as well as with others, I kind of make a critique on the North American modernist planning, in the sense that although it did provide density, which is a good thing, I think it could provide a little bit more without the overcrowding, because of these large buildings within these large superfluous open spaces, which aren't really being utilized, especially noted from my observations. So the idea is, yeah, to like infill certain underutilized spaces. The example here in Thorncliffe, I'm building within a park, but more so it's kind of taking up these parking lot spaces that are not being used. If you even look at a Google Maps image or visit the site in person, you'll notice that there's few cars and most of the parking lots are empty. And that's something I noted throughout several of my visits.
But you did not produce or look into how that actually works, because I don't think I've seen a drawing of.
No. That it was kind of just addressed through text.
Okay.
And maybe I'll ask Noheir and Will and Marco if there are any questions of clarification. I know that you're more familiar with the work.
No, not at this time, no.
Yeah, not for me too.
Okay. I think if there are no other questions of clarification, we can move into more comments and questions, and maybe I'll start in the reverse order with our guests, with Sasha being able to ask the first question or comment.
All right, let's start this. So I'm very intrigued by the effort and by the analysis, and which I think is spot on. I think your understanding of the needs, your understanding of this particular community, your understanding of inadequacy of the existing housing stock is very good. You identified a need. You identified the way the community acts on the existing physical structure quite acutely and beautifully through diagramming. So my questions are not about the analysis itself, but more about your response, to which I have a series of questions to ask and some suggestions to perhaps make the project and the research more robust. I think the first one, just dovetailing to my question about the existing site, I think the project itself remains a purely academic exercise if it's not rooted to its site. And while you perhaps refer to it in text relative to the Thorncliffe, it actually doesn't tell me much other than relational qualities between the building and open spaces. And then within the buildings, doesn't tell me much about its density or anything for that matter. It doesn't tell me much about the site fit, doesn't tell me much about a comparative site fit to the existing built form and so on. And one could, if you try to do this, one could find out that your density is double the density of what's there right now, but you could also find out that it is half the density of what's there right now. And then the questions of affordability come to mind. One of the reasons these particular neighborhoods are being occupied or inhabited, if you wish, by refugees, and I evidence that as immigrant to Canada about 25 years ago as well, have to do very much with affordability. And the affordability is, as you well know, tied to two things. One of them is the cost of actual construction, and the other one, the cost of land, which we both know in Toronto are extremely high. And as such, they become less and less, these communities are only affordable because of the old housing stock and high density, right? So that then dovetails back to the low density that you've provided. And when I see the excerpt of a site plan, I see that the spaces in between buildings are still very large, which leads me to think that you will not be able to replace the density that's on site and I don't know that because we haven't seen the drawing exactly and the density per square mile or density per acre and so on. And so as such, I think you work, as you get into the details of the project, you work against yourself, because what you're proposing is, for lack of better term, pie in the sky, because while it solves relational and maybe perhaps I would suggest a new social framework, it sort of defeats itself or shoots itself in the foot, defeats itself at the very beginning, because it financially will not hold. So that's sort of one thing, and I'm not sure if you want to respond to that, or is that a good enough critique for you to either consider in the future?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's perfect. I think I misunderstood your question. I did do a study on density. It's shown in these drawings, but it's also shown in a chart in my text. But the thing with although Thorncliffe does provide density, it's because there's just so many apartment towers. The rooms aren't really efficient at all. As you can see on the left here, the rooms are massive. For a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom, it's 206 square meters. So and then conversely, you could see in the middle here, the contemporary condo, it's very, very much minimum comfortability. So then once again, kind of in between is this proto design. It's providing density in terms of the units, but I do see what you mean in terms of the fact that it's mid-rise. It obviously can't provide the same density that these high-rise condos. So the kind of argument is it's those kind of mediating that line between providing density, but also making it comfortable and connected and human scale.
But you're saying there's also a site plan in addition to this, Nicola?
There, I believe so.
That's fair. If you don't mind staying on those drawings, that's perfect, because this leads me to my second point that I'll bring up, which is so density on site is one big item. The other item that is both, and I'll talk to it from the perspective of efficiency on one end, and then connection to the social network, which you're intuitively considering something some of our colleagues call urban surface, which is the combination of the building facing the public realm and the actual ground in the public realm itself. So by placing the generous corridors, as you did on one side, you have done one thing that's fairly it's beautiful. There's a prospect of it functioning very well. However, it's not seen very often, for a very reason that a single loaded wide corridor is a very expensive proposition. So as such, it sort of again defeats the purpose of affordability and possibility. So that's one part, and maybe that's something that's not being considered in the school setting, which I would presume it hasn't, and that's okay. When we consider cities in which citizens feel a duty to participate in public life, whether you're talking about Barcelona's Rambla or places from where immigrants have come from. There, in our observations, there are two things that are kind of critical to that. One is there is a certain sense of civic duty, even though it's not felt that way, but a civic duty to engage with your neighbors on the in the public realm. And I think that's one of the things that you recognized and tried to introduce that on the in the red or pinkish portion of your plan. However, what you've taken is the density of those events from the street and spread them over 5 levels of your building. And so you're hoping now that that informal gathering and informal conversations will happen, or contacts will happen in a very or much higher amount of space, or much larger amount of space, and therefore will effectively reduce amount of intensity, or reduce the intensity of those encounters, which I think is counterproductive in what you're doing. So those two things to me are jarring. And you mentioned Young Gell several times in your presentations. We were fortunate enough to do some work with him personally over the years. And one of the discussions that we had was how that civic duty of how our feeling of wanting to engage in a public space is directly proportionate to the size of balconies in the residential suites. If you look at La Rambla, or if you look at many of the European cities, the balconies are actually fairly tiny. And while they provide a respite from the interior of the building, they're big enough for you to see your friend on the street to go engage. Right. And so in my mind, once you've sort of diluted the intensity for potential encounters by creating so many opportunities for that, I think you're diluting the density of events that you were hoping to, or you're sort of premising your entire project on. And then the last thing I'll advise for you to look at both the series of housing projects that have been replaced with different forms in England, all of which have worked around open air corridors, single loaded buildings, and so on, for a variety of reasons, including crime. And then work of Rosanna Montiel, a friend from Mexico City, who has actually gone into one of the modernist projects and did exactly what you talked about, which is introduced structures that kind of increase stickiness for those that habitate in the buildings around it, and then change the parking lots into playgrounds and places to linger and places to gather and so on. But I think ultimately, in my mind, there seems to be a disconnect between the understanding of density and where it happens and why it happens, and then density of events. That's a direct product of architecture.
Yeah, those are all really helpful projects. Projects to look at, and also comments. I think, the idea is that since the city is so compact, and this complex is kind of located in the heart of the neighborhood, adjacent to the park, which is one of the few gathering spaces in the city. So centralizing that and incorporating all of these third places, community spaces, as well as having this housing project, the idea was that it was kind of act as a magnet and actually bring people in. But I do see what you mean, that when you kind of spread it across, and you spread this density across multiple levels, you're kind of not centralizing it anymore. So that's a good aspect to consider.
Well, I generally don't think of density of people, but the density of events, right? And if you have too many events for too few people, then or hope for too many events or opportunities for those events, then those events are not going to happen, right? I think there's a sort of a.
Could I
be really important to understand how many people, to study, if you want to go back and study the places or the cities from where the immigrants come from, and understanding of the size of the public space relative to density, there seems to be a real disconnect in that, in my mind, at least just looking at it without studying the numbers.
Could I just quickly ask you the project Mexican architect you mentioned? The
Her name is Rosanna Montiel. And she's been writing on the success of that project for quite a long time. Montiel is Montiel. Yeah, I'm not sure what the name of the project is. Like, I think it's on Art Daily or something, or you should be able to find it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll move on to Rocco for our next comment and question, and we'll come back around to everyone as well.
I think, Nicola, the theme that you selected to deal with, it's very labyrinthine. I think each and every single one of us has gone through, if not individually, but our parents, our grandparents, into this whole concept of migration. For the last 20 years or so, I kind of gave up architecture because it wasn't really resolving very much in life, and began to look at this whole issue of migration. What does it mean? What does it do? So that initial concept or the initial theme, it really needs more in-depth evaluation from you or anybody. I take the word immigration always as a negative element. We all talk about it negatively. And I turned that into I am migration. I'm migration. Each one of us is a migrant. And when I read your paper, and I read it more than once, I must admit, because I'm intrigued and I'm interested in it. And then I went from your initial intellectual and academic and research component, which could use more, into the proto design. It recalls whenever I go to Venice, I go to the ghetto. And the ghetto has a negative connotation, always had a negative connotation. But if you live there, if you live in the ghetto, which I did for about a year, you begin to discover this kind of passion and sensitivity about people and about the place. You make it your own place. Now, I go from here to Thorncliffe Park. I happen to have done the school. I renovated the school there, Valley Park, not far from it. Valley Park is at the corner of Don Mills and the road that takes you to Thorncliffe Park over the bridge. And it's the same people that live here and live on the other side, Flemington Park, that are the new Canadians. We call them new Canadians. We used to call them new Canadians. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it happens that in studying these neighborhoods over time, if you do anything, first they offer a sense of arrival, a sense of welcoming. It does not ask who you are. And then people, as you picked up in your study of St. Clair, it picks up little nuances of what people who arrive will start to do. In this project that you've done, you're almost doing everything for them. I think I would have loved to see Thorncliffe Park without a new development, but a way to get all your interconnectivity to improve them, or to create an infrastructure that would be suggestive of people that we keep coming there. The actual building itself, I could have seen it if, let's say, there was some terribly wrong things with the existing facility, the existing buildings, and gets blown up, like they did at Prut Eagle many, many years ago in the 60s. It gets blown up because it had problems. So I kind of miss this route, this journey, how you go from that initial theme to a new building, to a prototype design. And that's the kind of my one concern. The other concern, actually, so response to Sasha, is to do with density. You know, when I came to Canada as a little boy, many, many years ago, we lived on College Street, which then many years later, it acquired the sobriquet of Little Italy. BS. It was never Little Italy. However, we all lived in little houses. In the house that I lived in on Mansfield, and by the way, I lived in 17 houses in 12 years. In that house I lived in Mansfield, 2 stories, 2 bedrooms upstairs. There lived 7 people that owned the house, and me, my mom, and my dad that moved upstairs in 1 bedroom. I think people today that come from somewhere else, that come to this country, they lack things that we do not have, or at least that they do not have that we have. So they adapt. And I can see some of the units, they probably, some of those apartment units, when I was doing the school at Valley Park, I was invited in their houses, in their apartments. Some of those people, they actually have family that moves in, and suddenly they had like 7 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. How do you measure density? If density in our definition is measured according to what the city municipal bylaws say, that's one thing. But people themselves, they bring people in, they help one another, and that is the beginning of a sense of community. So I won't worry too much about density. I would be more concerned about allowing people to create their place with what they find. Otherwise, we begin to gentrify every little nook in the city. And even though it's a metropolitan area now, no matter where you go, people cannot afford. And the refugees, the immigrants, migrant, whoever comes, they have to go further and further away, or just strictly live wherever they can find a place. So you've got to be careful that any new building, any new construction begins to put different kind of pressure. Marco, I don't know if you remember, but many, many years ago when they did Crombie Park was supposed to be co-op housing. Well, it just happened that some people who could afford more than a co-op went to live there. So if you do something always so perfect, so beautiful, so nice, so clean, so opportunistic, it brings in a different kind of person rather than serve those who truly need it, who truly left something behind. You need to understand, what did they leave behind in order to come here? It's not what they find here, but where do they come from? If they come from Syria, if they come from the camps in Syria and Jordan, if they come from poor mountainous portions of Italy or the Middle East, it becomes extremely difficult. We need to understand that. So I'm only giving this little chat because it is an incredible, difficult solution. I think you've done an incredible job to take, it makes me think, let me put it this way. The benefit for me is that it makes me think. It clarifies some of my own thinking. And I doubt it, what I'm saying will clarify some of your thinking, but you never know. Anyway.
Oh, it definitely has. And you bring an interesting perspective to the entire discussion. That's definitely something that we have to think about, right? As some of us architects, some of us, like, I'm trying to be an architect, maybe sometimes the best solution is when you create this pristine building in this area, you have to think about the idea of, you know, that what if the place becomes gentrified and you keep on pushing these marginalized communities outward or making where they live more expensive. So I think that's something that I have to address in the writing a little bit more, but it's at the very least a very interesting perspective to bring to the discussion. So thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Rocco. Roberto, would you like to?
Yes. Thank you, Nicola. It was a very, I think, interesting but also inspiring presentation. So I really want to commend you on that. And also I found the drawings and the visualization very inspiring. So a couple of things. I think Rocco and Sasha said a lot about the design, and I agree with both comments about the public realm, the site, and also how difficult and hard it is to envision and predict how immigrants will adjust and will adjust to Toronto, to mostly very, I would say, hard neighborhoods, or let's say tough neighborhoods like Thorncliffe Park. My first set of comment is about research and thesis. So I think the structure of your thesis, I don't know if that's a structure that you get from your program, is extremely clear. So you have a problem, you identify the problem, the identification of the problem is extremely clear. Then you have a set of principles that you think are going to work and inspire you, and you analyze them, and then you apply them to a specific design challenge. Okay. The structure is very clear, although I think that what the structure is lacking a bit is friction. So it's a very linear structure. So there is a problem, you identify some best practices, and then you apply them. So, and more or less this can work, but I would expect from a thesis a much more critical approach, mostly in the analysis of your conceptual framework. So all the stuff that you're mentioning, Yangel, Christopher Alexander, and the idea of informality, we know this stuff a lot. And in Toronto, we try to apply them. So we know, for example, if you look at the work of Jerome Markson, Alexandra Park, or even the experimental project in Brampton, he tried to apply these concepts. So he tried this idea of the in-between space, he tried to apply the idea of a small scale, a human scale environment, but at the end, the work was not successful until the point that, for example, in the last 5 years, they decided to redevelop Alexandra Park because it was not really working. So although I appreciate a lot all this conceptual, the network of conceptual framework that you are putting together, I was hoping a more critical approach towards a bunch of approaches that we know now they are not as successful as we might think they could be. Okay. And also because I think all this idea of blurry the boundaries between public and private are interesting and are promising, and we have to do it, but they change. So the design strategy needs to change from place to place. So for example, according to my experience, because I really I'm really interested in the public realm, and that's what I teach more or less. And the perception and the practices involving the public realm and shaping the public realm are very different in Toronto from what they are, for example, in Mexico City or what they are in Italy. And I can tell you that every time we try to borrow stuff from outside Canada, outside Toronto, and try to then project it on Toronto, we fail. Okay, so in this process of translation, you really have to be critical. Okay, and to give you just 2 examples, I will just try to. The first example was, of course, the work of Jerome Markson. The second example is, I would say, just to build up on what Sasha said, is a much deeper understanding of the ground conditions. So when I say ground conditions, I'm not just referring to the physical context, I'm mostly referring to the policy context. Okay, so the ownership that Rocco was asking about is crucial.
Yeah.
Because you are building on a public park. So how do you manage to do that? Okay, so I think that's really important. The ownership model, all the references that you have, for example, the one in Berlin. So in that case, they are extremely successful and they're extremely innovative, mostly not because of the design. If you look at the design, it's not as innovative as other aspects, like, for example, the tenure model.
Yeah.
The tenure models there are very innovative. So I think once if you want to deal with these specific subjects like hosting immigrants or social housing, public housing, you really have to rethink the tenure models, okay? Because we know that the traditional social housing, public housing model, they might not work, okay? And then, I mean, in terms of more details, aspect of your project, I would say, I agree with Sasha, the relationship between the private and public realm needs a bit of work, mostly because I think you are very optimistic about the conditions of adjacency. So, for example, when you saw the extra rooms that you are providing facing the corridor, the truth, they don't really have enough privacy, according to me. So, in terms of, for example, in terms of noisy, or just in terms of sites, you really want to maybe improve the again, the connection, the relationship between the rooms facing the corridor and the corridor itself. Also, what happens there is, I think the corridor, it's an interesting idea, the corridor facing the street, but I think if you want to achieve, if you want to see the corridor as an expansion of the street, at least I would say maybe on the second level, you really need to facilitate the connection between the street and the second level, okay? So perhaps, I don't know, the section of these corridors changes based on the level. So the second level, the corridor can be wider because maybe you have more public programs in direct connection with the street or the sidewalk. And then as you move up, the corridor shrinks because, I don't know, you have less public programs and more private programs, okay? And one last comment, and then I'll just let the other guests to have the second round, is that it's not really clear to me whether you are working on a pilot project or a site-specific project. So if it's a pilot project, I think your project really needs to clarify what the standardized or standard aspects or elements of your project are and what's site-specific, okay? And of course, one of the key questions is, if it's a pilot project, how it replicates. So for example, in your case, I think right now, your project really feels like a fragment. It's almost like all these experiments from the 60s, where we designed these amazing projects, but they feel like fragments in the city. They are very unique, they are very specific, but they cannot really expand beyond their sites. And Alexandra Park is one of these examples. But for example, Italy is full of them. So we developed these social experiments, but then for some reason, we were not able to expand them beyond the site boundaries. So if you see your project as a pilot project, it would be very interesting to see, even in the context of Thorncliffe Park, how your proto design can then start I would say, affecting other portions of the neighborhood.
I can tell that your Noheir's colleague, she made the same comment in my last milestone, which is interesting or funny. But the comments on the actual booklet or the layout of my thesis, I think they're definitely valid. It's something that I'm not sure if I would say I struggle with it, but this is kind of just how my brain works. I work very like in order. So that's kind of why you see that the document is laid out that way. But those frictions that you were talking about, yeah, I think they're needed. So thanks for bringing that insight into the conversation.
Thank you. There's a lot of really good discussion and comments.
For sure.
About the density, the policy, the research itself, the idea of immigration and I am migrant, and the agency given to the inhabitants. And I'm wondering, before we go to another round of comments from our guests, if the rest of the committee would like to comment on the discussion that's currently happened and engage in the discussion. And then maybe what we'll do is give our guests one more round of comments, and then we'll come back to you for your final closing comments. So I don't know if Marco or Noheir or Will, if you'd like to make any comments, or I can just go back to another round of comments from our guests.
I'll just add something quickly, and I'm also just mindful of time, so we need to be a little brisk here. But just very quickly, one of the things that I see, Nick, in what you're working with here is something that comes up whenever we start to deal with the attempt to formalize or architecturalize things that tend to happen informally, right? So there's a kind of tension between things that just kind of happen organically without the aid of architects. And then when architects get their hands on things, and inevitably we do what we know, which is architecture. One of the things that strikes me, at least in my experience, of what makes these communities so vibrant and the real gift that they bring to the host communities is the public life. And my memory of growing up in an Italian neighborhood in Vancouver, back in the 60s when immigration was still fresh, let's say, right? There's a lot of first generation Italian immigrants at that era. The real experience of that was the commercial street. Everyone kind of lived in the neighborhood, and the houses were very conventional and as Rocco said, very full. But the real community or the real sense of identity came from those commercial streets. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is how those are in many ways kind of quite informal in the sense that the reason they work so well is because of the small scale of the commercial unit, right? And the ability for people, at least at that time, to participate in that commercial life because it was modest in scale. A lot of these communities are extremely entrepreneurial and adaptive to working with found conditions. And I wonder whether maybe, one of the challenges with Thorncliffe is it is not a traditional street-oriented community. And I think that adds an additional layer of complexity to bringing this kind of public life into fruition. So that's one of the things that strikes me is that a lot of the things that we often try to or draw inspiration from actually happen informally, and when we try to formalize them, something gets lost in that translation.
Okay. Any other comments before we go to final comments?
Maybe I can add just a little bit to that. I think one of the things that might be missing then is how this project actually fits into Thorncliffe, because it kind of goes away in the process of presenting it, which I think is a bit of a pity, because all of these moves that Nick's been doing actually, because Thorncliffe isn't going away. This is sort of being plugged in. It's supposed to transform it in quite radical ways. It'd be nice to see how that is imagined, I think. Because all that stuff that Marco was talking about, because suddenly you do have a street that you can buy stuff on. You don't have to drive a car and all that. I would probably think about making that explicit and think, urbanistically, what all of this stuff is doing. And you kind of mentioned in passing that you're bringing a lot of the stuff that's being forced out because of development, you're moving it into Thorncliffe, which means you don't have to take your car to it anymore, and it becomes part of the community. These are pretty smart and sensitive moves, but they're not really obvious. So it might be nice if you just clarified that a little bit. I'll leave it there.
Noheir, did.
Yeah, I think that conversation is really getting more interesting. I just have like one comment, or maybe Nick can clarify this thing regarding this community, because he said it's all rent and people are definitely changing. Although we know that, or maybe you can clarify about the demographics of the people living in Thorncliffe a bit. But also, would this situation and change as like this is like the norm of the situation in such neighborhoods, and actually with the immigrant population, like what in this project could be seen as like flexible or has the ability to change your plugins, and what's not? Like what would you claim to be like a fixed part of the community, a fixed part of the urban scape, and what do you think can be changing or would allow to change by time?
I think I kind of show it in some of the renderings, and I think several aspects kind of afford the residents some sort of flexibility, whether, or at least that's what it seeks to do, whether that be the actual framework and how I showed it being utilized in different ways, or that indeterminate space in between the shared corridor and the family unit. And so things like that, or the multifunctional space, which is, I build the framework, like these pavilions that you can see highlighted in yellow. I build the framework, but the actual unit inside, there's just that layer of privacy with the curtain, but the rest is glass. And below that, there's this kind of pavilion or like structure. I feel like some of these provide the, at least in my mind, could provide some of the flexibility to the residents.
Thank you. So why don't we move to final comments, and maybe we'll start with Sasha and work our way through everyone again.
I have to say I really enjoyed how everybody had a slightly different contribution to the conversation. And while all of these thoughts have probably crossed all of our minds, we've kind of, I think, succeeded in complementing each other in our review and assessment. And I think, Nicola, like this is, it's recorded, right? So I think you should take advantage of the information and knowledge that was shared with you if you want to improve your project, and if not, then at least into the future as you think about these things. I think there certainly, it would be lovely if you're going to spend more time on the project. It would be lovely to make it more robust and answer these questions, because hopefully this interest remains with you, and you're going to take this knowledge into the practice, right? And just stay interested in that. That's my only message and hope, because it's quite quickly that one gets disillusioned once facing all the pragmatic questions of practice.
Thank you. Rocco?
So the issue of migration is an ongoing element in Canadian growth and society. It will never end because it never began. It just keeps going. I like to think that the issues that have been raised today applies to human living, to each and every single one of us. So migration, immigration, or migration, what you call it, is nothing but the seed that keeps us thinking. I think this has been an issue, especially now, of affordability of housing. Affordability of housing usually comes, the most expensive element is land. So the question is, how do we deal with that? Nicola, I'm doing a bit of consulting work with a non-for-profit organization where we're looking, or at least they're looking, at purchasing odd-shaped lots, corner lots that are long and narrow. And the idea, and you may know, or some of you may know, of the old houses in Central Island, Wards Island, they were on a lease basis. The government of Canada leases land to get oil from the ground, and then they screw it up and they give the land back, it's worthless. Exhibition place, we did a hotel and exhibition place on leased land. So perhaps you should consider if I may suggest, this concept of the land is leased. It remains in the hands of the public. I believe Mumford, many years ago, when he wrote one of his first books, it shows how old I am, did make a reference to the concept of land basically remains in the ownership of the public sphere, the public realm. In this way, what happens then, you can do that concept and you can build affordable housing and you spread it. Sometimes it's a project like yours. Sometimes it's 5 houses on a narrow lot in areas where they have great schools, in areas where they have great transportation, in areas where they have all the other facilities. Because if we think of Toronto, in areas like Jane and Wilson, in areas like Albion and Steeles, I mean, you name it. These are so-called negative ghettos. Yes, people are forced to live there, but they do not have that ability to move out or to improve their well-being because they don't own it. So we have to figure out a way to give them a sense of ownership without having to spend $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 million to do it. Because these people who come, their need is to help their children, like our parents helped us. You know, Marco, you mentioned it in Vancouver. I can tell you stories here. Noheir, everywhere. So we need to be creative in that beginning portion in order to create good architecture. That's it. Thank you.
Looking at the larger image before the architecture.
Spread it. Spread across Toronto. Toronto is, well, anyway, that's my.
Thank you.
Roberto?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I mean, I really enjoy also. Thank you, Rocco and Sasha and Carlo, Will and Marco and Noheir, because I really enjoy the conversation. And I think your thesis, although we criticized in some question, your proposal, I think your thesis is asking the right questions. So, and I think from this point of view, I really appreciate your efforts to deal with such social issues and try to understand how architecture can approach them. I don't think architecture can solve them, but there is an important special component that can make the life of migrants and the life of newcomers just better. Moving forward, I think your thesis can really benefit from I think a deeper understanding of the ground condition. Sorry for repeating this again, but it's really important because, again, one other aspect that I think your project is doing, which I think it's not really what you want, is in some way putting newcomers in a very odd position at the center of the neighborhood. It's almost like you are exposing a state of exception. You are creating a state of exception, which it's not what you want. Okay, so perhaps to go back to what Rocco was proposing, try to think about how this proto design can be better infill the neighborhood and almost like to go back to something you said about plugging in your design and how your design can be integrated a bit more in the neighborhood, because right now you are placing it at the center of the neighborhood and feels very isolated. Perhaps your ambitions are correct, but the outcome, the spatial outcome, feels very isolated and too much right at the center of the neighborhood. So just my final comment is that moving forward, you really want to think about how your pilot project ground and lands in the city. Okay, and what you need to do to really make this connection between the neighborhood and the proto design much stronger. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. So why don't we get some brief final comments from the rest of the committee? Maybe we'll go Marco, Noheir, and then Will as a supervisor can end.
Thanks, Carlo. Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think this has been a very thorough discussion, and I agree. I think it's extremely important area of research, and I think just the beginning. I hope just for you, the beginning of much more interest in this area. Very difficult, very complex, and not necessarily, as Roberta said, solved by architecture, but certainly architecture has something to contribute. So I hope you will continue in this vein.
Noheir, did you want to?
Yeah, I think like throughout your journey, or Nicola, you've asked the right questions, and you've like worked thoroughly to do proper analysis of the area and like find solutions. And I think Roberta's suggestion of having a critique, a parallel critique to your thesis, maybe is this a way to look at the whole structure of your thesis and provide a parallel critical view of what you've done, and also being able to say what's solvable and what's not at this stage.
Yeah,
right.
I think it would be great to add to the kind of like conclusion.
Yeah.
Throughout, but
yeah, I really commend you on all the work done so far.
thanks, Noheir.
I'll just finish off, being especially mindful of time, just to say that was probably one of the best discussions I've had in a thesis in quite a long time. So thank you very much for that. I think there's a lot learned by everyone. It's very thoughtful. So thank you for that. I'm very grateful on behalf of Nicola and for me too. Yeah, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what Nicola does. Maybe we should, if we're going to wrap it up. Well, anyways, I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the committee, and thank you, Nicola. It was a really engaging presentation, and you asked the questions: how to make something more livable, how to make habitat more livable, how to design for all people, and the conversation definitely was surrounding that, and there's a lot of great input given. So we're going to deliberate, and we're going to ask you to step out of the Zoom, and then Will's going to contact you with your final results.